Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening everyone. Welcome back in my YouTube channel with me, Yusrolana. In this video, I would like to explain you about translation and interpreting. Here, I would like to explain the chapter 3 of Introducing Translation Studies. There are 4 scholars here. The first one is Jacobson, the second one is Nida, the third one is Newman, and the last one is Kohler. Okay, let's start from the Jacobson first. Roman Jacobson. The theory is the nature of linguistic meaning and equivalence. Jacobson described 3 kinds of translation. The first is interlingual, and intersemiotic. But here, Jacobson focused on interlingual. So, interlingual referring to translation between 2 different written sign systems. And then Jacobson goes on to examine key issues of this type of translation, notably linguistic meaning and equivalence. And then Jacobson follows the theory of language proposed by the famous Swiss linguist Saussure in 1857 till 1913. Saussure distinguished between the linguistic system, langue, and specific individual utterance, parole. Then, central to this theory of langue, he differentiated between the signifier. Signifier means the spoken and written signal, and the signified. Signified is the concept, which together create the linguistic sign. So, signifier adalah sebutan dari bahasa yang bermacam-macam, sedangkan signified adalah objek dari sebutan-sebutan tadi. For example, is rice in English and nasi in bahasa Indonesia and sego in Java. But nasi, rice, and sego, the object of them is nasi. Nah, nasi, objek nasi di sini disebut signified. After that, Jacobson then moves on to consider the theory problem of equivalence in meaning between words in different language and part of Saussure parallel. He points out that there is ordinarily no full equivalence between code units. So, what is cheese in English is not equivalent in the Thailand formaggio because the Italian code unit doesn't include the concept. For example, cottage cheese. On the other hand, linguistic universalism considers that although languages may differ in the way they convey meaning and in the surface realizations of that meaning, there is a more or less shared way of thinking and experiencing the world. On the other hand, linguistic relativity or determinism in its strongest form claims that differences in language shapes different conceptualization of the world. So, in linguistic universalism, we can say that bahasa boleh berbeda-beda, tapi dalam convey meaning kita punya pemikiran yang sama, kita mempunyai arti yang sama meskipun bahasanya berbeda-beda. Berbeda dengan determinism, Determinism itu adalah berbeda bahasa, juga berbeda arti, seperti itu. Kemudian, here, Jacobson, the theory of Jacobson is determinism. Why? Because Jacobson berpikir bahwa di setiap country itu memiliki experience berbeda-beda, sehingga beda bahasa pasti bedalah arti, seperti itu. The second scholar is Nida and the science of translating. So Nida solves Chomsky's model for decoding the source text and produce for encoding the target text. The surface structure of the source text is analyzed into basic elements of deep structure, which are then transferred in the translation process and reconstructed into the surface structure of target text. Central to Nida's work is the move from the old idea that a word has a fixed meaning and toward a functional definition of meaning, in which a word acquires meaning through its context and can produce varying responses according to culture, like that. And then, according to Nidas here, meaning is divided into three. The first is linguistic meaning, means that the relation between different linguistic structure. And the second is referential meaning, means the denotative dictionary meaning. And the third is connotative, means that the associations a word produces. Then Nida defined two types of equivalence. The first one is formal equivalence, and the second one is dynamic equivalence. Okay, the first one, formal equivalence. Formal equivalence focuses attention on the message itself in both form and context, and one is concerned that the message in the receptor language should match as closely as possible the different element in the source language. The second one is dynamic equivalence, based on what he calls the principle of equivalent effect, where the relationship between receptor and message should be substantially the same as that which existed between the original receptors and the message. Then the message aims at a complete naturalness of expression. After that, according to Nida, a successful translation has to make sense and then has to convey the spirit and manner of the original. The third is has to have a natural form of expression and then produce a similar response. Okay, then we move to the third scholar, that is Newmark. The theory of Newmark is semantic and communicative translation. Departing of Nida's model, Newmark claimed that the success of equivalent effect is illusory, and that the gap between emphasis on source or target language will always remain the overriding problem in translation theory and practice. Here, Newmark defined translation into two. The first one is communicative translation and the second one is semantic translation. Communicative translation means that communicative translation resembles Nida's dynamic equivalence in the effect it is trying to create on the target text reader, while semantic translation has similarities to Nida's formal equivalence. Well, the last scholar is Kohler, and the theory is equivalence relation. Then in this theory, there are two things. The first is correspondent. Correspondent compares language system and describe difference and similarities contrastively, and its parameters are those of Yusrolana. And then the second is equivalence. Equivalence relates to equivalent item in specific source text to target text and a pair and context, and the parameter is the parameter of equivalent is parallel. Then in this theory there are 5 types of equivalence relations. The first is denotative. Denotative is related to equivalence of its extralinguistic content of the text, and the second is connotative, related to lexical choices, especially between near synonyms. The third is text normative equivalence, and this is related to text type. The fourth is pragmatic equivalence or communicative equivalence, and this is oriented toward the receiver or the text or message, and this is Nida's dynamic equivalence. The last type of equivalence relation is formal equivalence, which is related to the form and aesthetic of the text, include wordplays and the individual stylistic feature of the source text. Okay, I think enough from me. I do apologize if there are many mistakes from me, from my explanation, maybe not clear enough. I do apologize. And the last I say is, Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dadah.